At 05:30 on December 16, 1944, First Lieutenant Lyle Bouck crouched in a frozen foxhole on Lanzerath Ridge, Belgium, listening to the silence that comes right before a storm. The snow had that glassy crust you could crack with a boot. His breath came out in white bursts, and every burst felt loud. Bouck was 20 years old. He had been in combat for a handful of weeks, and he was holding a gap in the American line that was never meant to be held by a platoon. Down the slope, through fog and pine shadows, he saw movement. Not a patrol, not a probing scout, a column. A long gray snake of men emerging from the woods like the forest itself was marching. German paratroopers. Fallschirmjäger. Around 500 of them, give or take. Enough to erase a small unit without even slowing down. They moved with a calm, trained rhythm, like men who believed the map belonged to them. Their orders were simple. Clear Lanzerath and open the road through the Losheim Gap. Because behind them, waiting like a steel tidal wave, was the punch of Hitler's last gamble. The armored spearheads tied to the First SS Panzer Division and the timetable that demanded speed. The irony. Bouck wasn't supposed to be here. He commanded an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, eyes and ears, not a fist. Recon units weren't meant to stand and die in place. But that morning, recon was the only thing the U.S. Army had on that ridge. The 99th Infantry Division had been stretched thin across the Ardennes. Too many miles, too few men, and someone had decided this ridge mattered enough to hold, even if the hands holding it were just 18 riflemen. Bouck's platoon had M1 Garands, a few carbines, a bar or two, and one light machine gun if you were lucky. No tanks, no minefields, no friendly infantry company dug in behind him. He knew what a real defense looked like. This wasn't it. He pressed his gloved fingers to the radio handset and called up the chain. He asked the question any sane officer would ask. "Permission to displace? We have major enemy movement." The answer came back fast, too fast to be reassuring. "Hold position. Reinforcements will support." Bouck stared at the trees below him. He did the math in his head. Reinforcements were miles away, the roads were about to be cut, and the Germans were already moving. 4 days earlier, Bouck had done something that technically wasn't his job. Something that would have gotten him chewed out on the parade ground. He had taken captured German identity cards and papers, the kind intelligence officers like to collect, and used them like currency. He traded them to the regimental ordnance channel for one thing. A jeep, armored, ugly, improvised, mounted with a Browning M250 caliber machine gun. It wasn't authorized the way a form was authorized. It was authorized the way war authorizes things, by necessity. The M2 wasn't a rifle. It didn't hit a target so much as punched holes through the idea of cover. It fired 12.7-meter rounds, heavy, loud, confident, at a pace that could turn an open field into a warning. Bouck had positioned that jeep in the center of his line. Behind the foxholes his men carved into frozen ground with entrenching tools and curses. The ridge gave them one gift, elevation, and elevation with a .50 caliber could look like a miracle. Bouck looked left, then right. His men were young, faces half hidden under helmets, cheeks raw from cold wind. But they weren't panicking. They were doing the thing good soldiers do when the world narrows. They were watching, waiting, and conserving every breath. With Bouck were also 4 artillery observers, men who could turn a radio call into steel falling from the sky, if the guns answered. But the guns were already busy. Because 90 minutes earlier, the Ardennes had woken up to a sound that didn't belong to winter forests. The Germans had opened the day with a wall of fire, massive artillery, rolling across the front. An attack so wide and so synchronized it felt impossible, until you realized Hitler had bet everything on surprise. In the fog, Bouck watched the paratroopers fan out at the base of the ridge. They weren't charging yet. They were measuring, like professionals deciding which tool to use. Bouck turned to the jeep gunner. He didn't give a speech. He didn't quote a manual. He said the simplest thing that keeps men alive: hold fire until they're close. The plan was not win. The plan was delay. Delay long enough to throw sand in the gears of the offensive behind them. Delay long enough to make the Germans hesitate, to make them overestimate what they faced. That's the secret of small unit defense. Sometimes you don't need to be strong. You need to look strong, long enough to steal time. The fog thinned just enough for Bouck to see assault waves forming. 3 groups, loose spacing, textbook infantry movement across a snowfield. When they began climbing, their boots left dark lines in the white. Their breath floated above them like smoke. They looked unreal, like ghosts crossing a blank page. Bouck waited. 75 yards, 60, 50. Then he gave the order. The Jeep-mounted M2 spoke first. A .50 caliber doesn't sound like a machine gun. It sounds like someone slamming a metal door over and over, fast enough to become a roar. The recoil rocked the Jeep. The muzzle flash cut through fog in orange stabs. The first burst tore into the lead German wave. Men dropped, not dramatically, just suddenly, like puppets with strings cut. The rest instinctively went prone, because training is a reflex and survival is older than pride. The American rifles opened up behind the 50s, hammering. Garands snapped in clean, sharp reports. Not volleys, not panic, aimed shots. Bouck's INR platoon wasn't a random draw of bodies. Recon tended to attract men who could think, move, and shoot. Men who scored well. Men who could keep their heads when everyone else started spraying rounds into fog. The Germans tried to crawl to the wire fence in front of the ridge, barbed wire half buried in snow. They had cutters. They had courage. But courage doesn't cross open ground when a .50 caliber has already written the rules. 8 minutes later, the first wave broke and slid backward into the tree line. Bouck counted bodies in the snow. He didn't feel triumph. He felt the cold arithmetic of it. They're going to do this again. Down below, German officers regrouped. They weren't yelling. They weren't panicking. They were surprised, because their intelligence had told them this sector was thin, a screen, a tripwire. Instead, they had encountered disciplined rifle fire and heavy machine gun suppression, exactly the signature you'd expect from a reinforced company, which was Bouck's first real victory. Not casualties. Confusion. The second assault wave moved. This time, the Germans adapted. They didn't just come straight uphill. They pushed squads toward the woods on both flanks, trying to wrap the American line like hands closing around a throat. Bouck redirected his bar teams toward the trees. He had no spare men. Every rifle moved left or right meant the center got thinner. The artillery observers keyed their radios and called for fire, coordinates on the assembly area below. A crisp request, professional, accurate. The reply came back like a shrug from a distant world. Stand by. The guns were busy. Regiments were getting hit. The whole front was on fire, and on this ridge, 18 men were suddenly very, very alone. MG-42 fire started from the tree line. Fast, ripping bursts. Americans had a name for that sound. Hitler's buzzsaw. It slammed into the berms and logs over the foxholes, filling the air with splinters and snapping branches. Bouck's men hugged earth and kept shooting. Short exposures, controlled aim. The M2 continued to dominate the open field. Every time a German rose to run, the .50 answered. And every time it answered, the assault lost momentum. 19 minutes of fighting. Then the second wave pulled back. Bouck took stock like a man counting coins while the bank burns. Ammunition was disappearing. Cold made hands clumsy. The M2's barrel was heating faster than it should in winter air. The Jeep gunner leaned down and shouted, "Sir, barrel's getting hot." Bouck nodded once. Short bursts. This is the quiet truth of machine guns. They're not magic. They're chemistry and metallurgy and limits. Push too hard, and the weapon punishes you at the worst possible time. If you like stories where small units rewrite the outcome of massive battles, hit like. It tells YouTube this kind of WWII storytelling matters. And if you want more forgotten actions from the Ardennes, subscribe to WWII Hidden Chapters. All right, back to Lanzerath. The Germans paused longer now, not because they were scared, because they were thinking. Bouck watched them mass in 3 places below the ridge. A coordinated assault was coming. Front pressure plus flanking teams in the woods. The kind of attack designed to make a small defense collapse from too many directions. Bouck radioed again. He reported what he saw. He asked for resupply. He asked for anything. The answer was always the same shape, even when the words changed. Hold. The 3rd assault began. The main force advanced across the field, while 2 squads slid through the eastern woods. Bouck's bar gunners opened up, short, hard bursts that chewed bark and forced the flankers to ground. The M2 fired in disciplined 3-round bursts now, not long streams. The rate of fire dropped, accuracy improved, but the psychological effect stayed. A .50 caliber doesn't just kill. It convinces entire squads they're being watched by something heavier than they expected. Mortars began falling, sharp thumps, then white eruptions in snow. Some rounds detonated half-buried, throwing powdery blasts that looked harmless until shrapnel sliced through pine logs. One observer tried again to bring counterfire. He transmitted calmly, like calm could bend the universe, but artillery priorities don't care about bravery on a ridge nobody can see. The 3rd assault pressed closer than the first 2, 40 yards. Then the bar team on the flank cut them down with fast magazine changes and raw determination. The Germans withdrew again. Bouck exhaled and felt something worse than fear. He felt inevitability, because the Germans were learning, and his ammunition was shrinking. By around mid-morning, Bouck's men had fired hundreds of rounds. Clips were getting light. Bandoliers were thinning. The M2's ammo boxes weren't bottomless. He looked down the ridge and saw German officers gathering again, binoculars up, pointing, tracing angles. They didn't act like a unit that had been stopped. They acted like a unit that had encountered a problem and decided to solve it properly. That's when Bouck understood the real danger. The Germans believed they faced more Americans than they actually did, and as long as that belief held, his platoon stayed alive. The moment the M2 went silent, the moment the firing cadence changed, the illusion would crack. Bouck moved along the line, low, fast, checking men. He didn't ask, "Are you scared?" He asked, "How many clips? How's your hands? Can you still feel your trigger finger?" His soldiers answered in numbers. Because numbers are what war reduces you to when the world is white and the enemy is 500 men deep. The 4th assault formed, wider this time, heavier, more concentrated. Roughly 400 men spread across the slope, using smoke grenades in patches. Not a wall, more like a moving net. They were trying to flood the ridge from edge to edge so Bouck couldn't shift fire. The M2 opened at 150 yards. The gunner aimed for leaders first, men who moved upright, who signaled, who carried cutters. The barrel shimmered with heat. The weapon was reaching its limit. Bouck's riflemen fired as if each shot was a decision carved into ice. No wasted rounds, no spray, targets, breathing. Squeeze. The Germans reached the wire, and for the first time all morning they cut through. A gap opened in the fence. Then another. Then another. The assault surged forward. The M2 rattled again. Short bursts, harsh recoil, metal straining. And then Bouck saw the nightmare coming before it arrived. The ammo box on the Jeep was almost empty. When the .50 caliber dies, it doesn't fade. It stops. Suddenly. Like a heart that just decided to quit. Bouck's men could feel it coming. So could the Germans. Bouck shouted the order he never wanted to say out loud. Fix bayonets. The ridge had been a long-range killing ground. Now it was about to become a hand-to-hand problem in a world of frozen fingers and steam breath and smoke. The M2 fired its last belt. The Jeep gun went silent. And down the slope, the German paratroopers accelerated. Bouck felt it. Like the air pressure changed. The enemy wasn't cautiously probing anymore. They were moving with the confidence of men who sensed the defense had finally blinked. Rifle fire increased to compensate. Garands cracked faster. Bars hammered the woods. But you can't replace a heavy machine gun with courage. Bouck looked at his ammo. He had less than he wanted. Less than he needed. And he knew exactly what the next 10 minutes meant. This was the moment where doctrine said a reconnaissance unit should break contact and disappear. But there was nowhere to disappear to. Behind them were roads leading toward supply depots and command posts, soft targets that the offensive hungered for. Bouck made the only choice that still bought time. He ordered his remaining shooters to keep firing at a pace that suggested fresh ammunition, not because it was true, but because belief was the last weapon he had left. And for a few more minutes, it worked. If you're low on ammunition, you conserve, you slow down, you ration. But Bouck wasn't fighting paper. He was fighting German perception. As long as his line sounded like it had teeth, as long as the rifles kept cracking in a steady rhythm, the Fallschirmjäger would keep believing they faced a bigger force. So Bouck did the only thing he had left. He turned his last ammunition into a soundtrack. His men fired short, sharp, regular shots. Not desperate bursts, not wild panic, just enough to make the enemy think they're still well supplied. The Germans hesitated. And in war, hesitation is a currency more valuable than bullets. The assault wave, after hours of being shredded by a weapon they couldn't see clearly in the fog, finally began to melt backward. Men rolled, crawled, dragged each other toward the tree line. Officers pulled them into cover and started counting who was left. Bouck didn't cheer. He didn't even smile. He looked down at his ammo pouches and felt the cold truth. He had won minutes, and minutes were all he could afford. He moved along the foxholes again, checking faces. One soldier's hands were shaking, part cold, part adrenaline. Another had blood on his sleeve from shrapnel that barely hurt now but would burn later. A forward observer, one of the artillerymen, had taken a hit in the shoulder. He'd wrapped it tight and kept working the radio like the wound was someone else's problem. Bouck reached the jeep. The M2 sat silent, barrel darkened from heat stress, metal strained like it had been pushed past what it wanted to be. Empty belts, empty boxes, empty promise. The jeep had done its job, but the jeep was finished. Bouck gathered the squad leaders close. Not for inspiration, for math. How many clips? Numbers came back like small confessions. 2. 1. Half a bandolier. None. Bouck added it in his head. Across the whole line, they had a few dozen rounds that still mattered. He radioed again. He didn't beg, he reported, because officers don't beg on the radio, even when they want to. Ammunition critical. Enemy battalion strength. We have no heavy weapon. Request immediate resupply or permission to displace. The answer was the same shape as before. Hold. That single word, hold, was a sentence. Bouck looked at the men around him. 18 recon soldiers, 4 artillerymen, a line of foxholes dug into frozen hillside, and 500 professionals below, learning and adapting. In the tree line, Bouck could see German officers walking and pointing, gathering fresh men, organizing. Not a broken unit, a unit resetting. Bouck knew what that meant. A new assault, not a probe, a solution. He made a decision that every training manual would hate and every veteran would understand. He redistributed the last ammunition to the best shots. If you had expert marksmanship, you got priority. If you didn't, you got a different job. Watch a flank, pass messages, prepare grenades, keep eyes open for the moment the line collapsed. The plan simplified into one brutal sentence. Shoot until it's gone. Then fight with what's left. Fresh Fallschirmjäger, men who hadn't been chewed up in the earlier waves. Moved out first. They advanced faster than the others had. More confident, more aggressive. The fog was thinner now. The slope looked longer, wider, and more hopeless. Bouck held his fire until they were close. Close enough that every shot could be counted. Close enough that the Germans would feel the bullets instead of just hearing them. When Bouck gave the order, the Americans fired a tight volley. Not a roar, a scalpel. Several Germans dropped immediately. The rest hit the snow and began working forward in small teams, fire and movement, exactly the doctrine that breaks weak lines. Without the M2, Bouck couldn't lock the whole field down anymore. He could only bite pieces out of it. A German squad on the left flank reached the wire and began cutting again. Another squad moved in the woods on the right, using trees as stepping stones, slipping between trunks, seeking a path to the foxholes from the side. Bouck shifted a bar toward the woods. The bar hammered, short bursts loud in the trees, kicking bark into the air, forcing the flankers to duck. But the Germans weren't trying to win by bravery. They were trying to win by geometry. The moment the Americans split their fire, the center got thinner. The moment the center got thinner, the Germans found the crack. A German team made it within grenade range of a foxhole on the western edge, one of the positions where the Americans had already burned through most of their ammunition. Bouck watched it happen in fragments, like a nightmare with missing frames. A helmet, a shadow moving low, a hand raising. A grenade landed short and exploded in snow. The blast threw powder and ice crystals across the foxhole like white sand. The American inside coughed, blinked, grabbed for his rifle, and felt the awful truth. Empty. There's a moment when your rifle goes dry and you realize the war has changed shape. It stops being a problem at 100 yards. It becomes a problem at 5 feet. The German paratrooper dropped into the foxhole, weapon up, and the American met him with the only tool left. The buttstock. It was messy, fast, and silent in the way close combat often is. No hero music, no speeches, just grunts and breath and brutal angles. The German stumbled back out. A second German leaned in, and a different American, one of Bouck's men with a few rounds left, fired at point-blank range. The 2 Germans fell in the snow like sacks. The third scrambled away toward the wire. Bouck saw the shape of the future in that little incident. Not if. When. If the Germans could reach the foxholes once, they could reach them again. And the next time, there wouldn't be ammunition to patch the hole. Bouck checked his own clips. A few rounds. Not enough to hold a line, just enough to choose how the story ended. Around him, the sounds of the fight were changing. Fewer rifle cracks, more German machine gun chatter from the tree line. More men shouting short commands in German, closer than before. The Americans' firing cadence, Bouck's last weapon, the illusion, was breaking down, and the enemy could hear it. A German officer stood up behind a tree line and waved his arm forward. Not a reckless charge, a controlled surge. About 50 paratroopers rushed the slope in a tight push. They didn't spread out, they didn't crawl, they ran like men who knew the defender was empty. Bouck shouted, "Grenades!" American hands, numb, clumsy, pulled pins. Grenades arced into smoke and fog and fell among running boots. Explosions kicked snow into the air. One German spun and dropped, another stumbled and kept moving. The rush kept coming. Bouck fired his last rounds at shapes in the fog until his rifle gave him that hollow click. He didn't feel fear. He felt a hard, cold calm, like his mind had chosen survival over emotion. Along the line, the same thing happened. The distinctive ping of an empty Garand clip, then silence. Men reaching for bayonets, men gripping entrenching tools, men turning into something older than soldiers. The first foxhole was overrun. A German dropped in, weapon up. An American jabbed a bayonet. A second German grabbed the rifle. Bodies collided in tight space. It lasted seconds, because close combat in a foxhole isn't a duel. It's a shove and stab chaos where whoever has numbers wins. Bouck saw 2 of his men dragged up and out at gunpoint. He saw a German officer shout, trying to impose control on the rush before it turned into slaughter. The Germans didn't want to lose more men to desperate bayonet fights in holes. They wanted the ridge. They wanted the road open. They wanted the timetable back. Bouck made the hardest call a young lieutenant can make. He ordered his men to stop resisting, not because he was surrendering a position, because he was saving what was left of the men who had already done the impossible. Hands went up, slowly at first, then all at once. The air felt strangely quiet, like the forest itself had been holding its breath. German paratroopers moved through the line, disarming Americans, pulling them from foxholes, pushing them into a loose group. And then something happened that Bouck didn't expect. The Germans looked confused. One Fallschirmjäger sergeant stared at the ridge, then at the Americans. He counted heads, once, then again, as if the number was wrong. He pointed at the silent jeep and the scorched M2 mount. He barked a question in German that didn't need translation. "How many machine guns did you have?" Bouck answered, through clenched jaw, through exhaustion. Something like, "One." The sergeant didn't believe him, because what they had heard, for hours, sounded like a reinforced company with overlapping weapons, ammunition resupply, depth. What they had actually fought was a small recon platoon with one improvised heavy gun that lasted just long enough to warp the enemy's assumptions. The German battalion commander arrived, stepping through snow and bodies, face hard but controlled. He looked at Bouck's men, young, filthy, exhausted, and did something rare in the middle of a major offensive. He treated them like professionals. Medics were brought up. Wounded were treated, German and American, because a disciplined unit doesn't forget it's disciplined just because it's angry. Bouck's men were searched, disarmed, and assembled for movement toward the village. Behind them, the ridge looked like nothing special, just trees and snow and holes in earth. But the tactical effect of those holes would ripple outward, because after losing so many men and spending so many hours on that ridge, the Germans did not immediately sprint forward the way a timetable demanded. They paused. Officers sent patrols into the woods behind the ridge. They expected more Americans. They expected tanks. They expected a second line. They found cold trees and emptiness. But by the time they accepted it was empty, the morning was gone. And in an offensive built on speed, losing the morning is like losing an engine. Somewhere behind the infantry, armored columns waited. Engines idled. Crews smoked and watched their watches. Because tanks don't flow through a road net until the road net is cleared. The Germans had a schedule. And the schedule had just been forced to acknowledge a brutal truth. You can't bully time. Before we move into what happened to Bouck's men as POWs and why their stand stayed missing for decades, I want you to weigh in. Do you think small actions like Lanzerath Ridge really change major offensives? Or are they just footnotes that feel bigger in hindsight? Drop your take in the comments. Seriously, I read them. And tell us where you're watching from: US, UK, Canada, Australia, Vietnam, wherever you are. This community is global. If you want more stories like this, units that were never supposed to fight, improvisations that weren't supposed to work, subscribe to WWII's Hidden Chapters. Because after this, Bouck's war doesn't get easier, it just gets colder. Bouck's hands were still shaking when the Germans marched them off Lanzerath Ridge. Not from fear anymore, from adrenaline draining out, and the cold moving back in. The battlefield behind them was quiet now, quiet in the way a place gets quiet after it has taken enough blood for one day. Snow kept falling, soft and indifferent, settling on craters and torn wire like it was trying to erase the evidence. Bouck looked over his shoulder one last time. He saw the foxholes, small dents in a hillside, and he felt something that would haunt him for decades. We held, and still we lost. That's the trap of being captured. Even when you've done everything humanly possible, capture feels like failure. The Germans moved them into Lanzerath Village, into buildings that smelled like damp wood and smoke. Wounded men were treated first, quick bandages, blunt instructions, no comfort. Then came the sorting. Searches, confiscated watches, removed knives, maps taken. Anything that looked like intelligence work got extra attention. Bouck had the sense, just for a moment, that the Germans still didn't fully believe him. They kept glancing back toward the ridge as if expecting more Americans to appear out of those trees. And that Right there was the last gift Lanzerath gave the Allies. Even after the fight ended, the enemy still moved like they were being watched. By nightfall, Bouck and his men were pushed onto the roads heading east. The first day of the Bulge was still unfolding, bigger battles igniting across the Ardennes. But for Bouck's platoon, the war had narrowed down to one question: how long can you stay alive as a prisoner in winter? Marching as a POW is a special kind of exhaustion. You're hungry, you're cold, you're injured, and you can't even pretend you have control. The guards weren't monsters in the Hollywood sense. Some were brutal, some were tired, some were just doing what collapsing armies do, pushing problems down the road. Bouck watched his men the way he watched Germans earlier that day, for signs of weakness, for signs someone might drop. Because if a man dropped in that weather, the cold didn't negotiate. 2 days later, after being shuffled through holding areas, barns, makeshift cages, they reached a rail yard, and that's where the modern world showed its ugliest convenience: boxcars. The Germans jammed prisoners into cattle cars designed for far fewer bodies. A sliding door slammed shut. Light became a narrow crack. Breath became a shared fog. Inside, the temperature fell fast. The floor was rough wood and old straw and ice. Men stood shoulder to shoulder because there wasn't room to sit. Those with wounds leaned against others, and the others pretended not to mind. The train moved. Stopped. Moved again. Stopped again. Time became meaningless. All that mattered was the rhythm of misery. No food, little water, no latrine except what you could improvise in a corner. Someone started coughing, then another, then three. In a sealed boxcar in winter, coughs were contagious in every way that mattered. Bouck tried to stay alert. He counted heads. He checked on the wounded. He told jokes that weren't funny and stories that didn't end well because stories were still better than silence. The worst part wasn't even the hunger. It was the feeling that you had been erased from the map. No unit would know where you were. No report would capture what happened on that ridge. You'd fought a battle that mattered, and then vanished. The train kept going deeper into Germany. Days blurred into each other. Men lost weight fast, lips cracked, hands swelled and stiffened. And in Bouck's head, one thought kept returning like a physical pain. We should have died up there. At least then they'd know we fought. That thought, quiet, poisonous, visits a lot of survivors. It's wrong, but it feels true when you're freezing in the dark. When they finally reached a camp, the first thing Bouck noticed was the smell. Coal smoke, latrines, wet cloth, sickness. The second thing he noticed was the look on the faces of older prisoners. Not fear, not rage. A kind of resigned knowledge, like they'd already done the math and stopped hoping the numbers would change. Bouck and his men were processed, registered, assigned. The Germans still ran the machine of captivity with paperwork, even while their country was collapsing. In the camp, hunger became routine. Thin soup, hard bread, sometimes nothing. Disease traveled faster than rumors. Dysentery, pneumonia, hepatitis. The cold didn't kill you dramatically. It just lowered your defenses until something small finished the job. Bouck watched men deteriorate. Men who had survived artillery and machine guns. Men who could have run 5 miles with full gear weeks earlier. Now they struggled to stand. But Bouck also watched something else. Something stubborn. His men stayed together. Not always physically. Camps split people. Transfers happened. Chaos rearranged lives. But psychologically, they behaved like a platoon even when the army was gone. They shared what little they had. They lied to each other in small ways that kept them alive. You look better today. This will be over soon. I heard the Allies are close. In early 1945, the distant thunder of war grew louder. Not artillery close. Something different. A vibration in the air that said front lines were moving. Allied bombing raids rattled windows. Guards became more nervous, more jumpy, sometimes crueler. Then, in spring, The rhythm changed again. Guards hurried. Roll calls got sloppy. The machine started to break. Liberation doesn't always arrive with a cinematic moment. Sometimes it arrives with silence, with guards simply not showing up. One morning, Bouck woke up and realized nobody was yelling orders. No boots pacing, no shouted German, just wind. Then the camp gates opened, and men who had forgotten what freedom felt like stepped out like newborns, unsteady, squinting at daylight. Bouck's body was lighter, his face sharper. His uniform hung like it belonged to someone else. But the weight he carried wasn't on his bones. It was in his head. I got captured. I failed. Back in the United States, Bouck did what millions of veterans did. He tried to become a civilian again. He slept in a real bed and still woke up cold. He ate food and didn't taste it. He walked past crowds and still saw fog and tree line. And whenever someone asked what happened during the Bulge, he gave short answers. Not because he didn't want to talk, because the story felt unreal even to him. We fought. We ran out of ammo. We got captured. And then he'd stop. Because how do you explain the part that mattered most? How do you explain that you held the line long enough to bend an enemy's schedule and still went to a POW camp believing you'd failed? Years passed. Then more years. The Bulge became a legend with famous names: Bastogne, St. Vith, Malmedy. And Lanzerath Ridge became a rumor, a footnote, a sentence someone might mention and move on from. And that is how history kills people a second time. Not with bullets, with forgetting. One day, years later, one of Bouck's former soldiers read a brief mention of the fight in an official account. A few lines, no details, no recognition. It hit him like an insult. Not to his pride, to the memory of the men who froze in foxholes and fought until empty. He contacted Bouck, and that phone call reopened a door Bouck had nailed shut in his mind. They began the long, exhausting war that happens after the war against bureaucracy. Letters, affidavits, statements from surviving men, requests up the chain. The army is a machine built to move forward. It does not like turning around. It does not like admitting it missed something. At first, the responses were polite and empty. We'll look into it. We have no documentation. Records are incomplete. Of course, the records were incomplete. The platoon had been captured. They weren't there to file after-action reports. Their radio had been the last thread, and then even that thread was cut. So Bouck and his men did what the battlefield had taught them. They improvised. They hunted down witnesses. They found historians. They collected German accounts where possible. They rebuilt the story from fragments and memory and the scars on their bodies. And Bouck refused a simple solution, because at one point, an award came. An individual medal, offered like a bandage. A way to close the file. Bouck didn't want a bandage. He wanted the truth. He said, in effect, if you recognize me, you recognize them. Because we fought as one unit. That stance cost time, years, but it also revealed the real core of the Lanzerath story. It was never about one hero standing alone. It was about a small group of men acting like a wall when the wall didn't exist. The campaign dragged on. And slowly, the system began to shift, because systems do shift when enough pressure is applied for long enough. Interviews were conducted. Survivors testified. Historians compared accounts. The action was re-examined. And then, decades after the Ridge, decades after the fog and the wire and the last belt of the M2, the Army finally did what it should have done early. It put a name and a weight on what happened. In the early 1980s, the recognition came in full force. Not a single medal to quiet the story, but a set of awards that matched the scale of what those men had done. Decorations for valor, unit citations, official acknowledgement that a platoon-sized force had delayed a larger enemy formation through discipline and firepower and sheer stubbornness. And the phrase that mattered most wasn't heroic. It was confirmed. Because once the Army confirms something, it becomes harder for history to erase. For Bouck, that recognition didn't feel like victory at first. It felt like grief, because time had done what time always does. Some men didn't live to see it. Others had lived, but had carried the weight quietly for decades, never knowing if anyone believed them. When surviving members of the platoon finally stood together again, older, slower, faces lined by decades, they realized the strange truth. They had fought the battle twice, once on the ridge and once afterward, to make sure the ridge wasn't forgotten. And here's the final twist that makes Lanzerath Ridge so brutally human. For a long time, Bouck believed capture meant failure, but the record eventually made something clear. They succeeded at the only mission that mattered. Not hold forever, not win outright, but delay, to slow momentum, to distort the enemy's picture, to buy the Allies time to react. In the Battle of the Bulge, time was everything. And time is exactly what 18 men, plus one improvised jeep gun, stole from a much bigger machine. That's why this story belongs in the hidden chapters. Because it's not clean, it's not cinematic victory. It's endurance, it's miscounted and misfiled courage. It's a young lieutenant making unauthorized decisions because doctrine didn't match reality. And it's a reminder that sometimes the people who change history don't get to know they changed it. Not for decades. If you made it this far, do me a favor. Hit like. It tells YouTube to show these white taboo stories to more people. Stories that almost got lost. Subscribe to WWII Hidden Chapters if you want more true events told like this. Small actions, huge consequences. And I want you to do one more thing. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Vietnam, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, anywhere. Because this community is how these memories stay alive. Also, tell me your take. Was Lanzerath Ridge a decisive delay, or an example of how chaos in war creates overlapping reasons for failure and success? Either way, those men did not disappear into silence. Because you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for remembering Lieutenant Bouck and the platoon that held a ridge the world almost forgot.